There is a stretch of upstate New York where you can still stand in a channel cut by hand nearly 200 years ago and read the drill marks in the limestone wall beside you. The men who cut that groove through solid rock left no monument with their names on it. They left something else instead. They left surnames, thousands of them, scattered through contractor payroll ledgers, parish registers, and the phone books of towns that did not exist before the canal ran through them. If your last name is Kelly, or Ryan, or Sullivan, or Walsh, or Roberts, or Evans, or Snyder, or Mueller, this may not be a story about strangers. It may be a story about the hands that dug the trench your family's name is still buried in, on paper if not in stone. Between 1817 and 1825, a canal was cut 363 miles across the width of New York State, and the labor that dug it came from places its planners never expected to recruit from. This is the story of who actually dug the Erie Canal, and the surnames the ditch left behind. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. When the project was first authorized, most people who mattered in New York politics thought it would fail. Governor DeWitt Clinton had pushed the canal through the state legislature against fierce opposition, and his critics were not gentle about it. Newspapers called it Clinton's folly. Others simply called it Clinton's ditch, a phrase meant as an insult that stuck around long after the insult stopped landing. The federal government had already declined to fund it. Thomas Jefferson himself reportedly called the plan little short of madness. A canal 363 miles long at a time when the longest canal in America ran barely 28. New York was going to have to build the thing on the state's own credit, with no trained civil engineers anywhere in the country to design it, because no American college yet taught civil engineering as its own discipline. That last detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because it shaped exactly who ended up digging the canal and how. The men who designed it, Benjamin Wright and James Geddes chief among them, were self-taught surveyors who learned engineering by doing it, one lock and one aqueduct at a time. The canal became, almost by necessity, the first working engineering school in the country, and the same improvisational, learn-as-you-go character extended straight down into the labor force. There was no established system for recruiting a workforce of this size for a project this specialized. The contractors who won sections of the route had to build their labor pipeline from nothing, the same way the engineers had to build their technical knowledge from nothing. The scale of the undertaking grew far past anything the original planners had budgeted for in either money or manpower. Estimates drawn from surviving contractor records put the total number of men who worked some portion of the canal over its 8 years of construction at somewhere close to 50,000, though the workforce at any single moment was far smaller, moving section to section as each stretch finished and the next one opened for bid. The canal was never built by one continuous crew. It was built by a patchwork of small contracts, most covering less than a mile of route, awarded to local men who then went out and hired their own labor gangs, sometimes a dozen men, sometimes 100. This meant there was no single canal company payroll in the way a modern reader might picture it. There were hundreds of separate, overlapping sets of records, kept to whatever standard the individual contractor happened to bother with, which is a large part of why the surviving record today is so uneven from one stretch of the route to the next. The plan on paper looked almost tidy at first. New York farmers would dig the canal themselves, section by section, in the slow months between planting and harvest, paid a modest day wage on top of whatever they already earned from their land. The middle section, the flattest ground around Rome, went first in 1817 for exactly that reason. Local men with local names worked it with ox teams, plows adapted for stump pulling, and their own two hands. For a while the plan held, and the surnames attached to that first easy stretch were mostly the same English and Dutch descended names already settled across upstate New York for a generation or two. Then the route reached ground the local farmers would not touch, and the entire labor system had to change. 2 stretches broke the plan completely. The first was at Lockport, where the canal had to climb the Niagara Escarpment, a wall of dolostone rising more than 60 feet above the surrounding land. There was no way around it and no way over it that would work for a boat canal. The engineers had to blast and chisel a channel straight through solid rock, a cut nearly 3 miles long and, in places, 30 feet deep into stone that had never been disturbed by anything sharper than frost. The second was the Montezuma Marsh, a stretch of wetland near the Seneca and Cayuga outlets where the ground itself seemed to resist being dug at all, where a shovel came back up as often with black muck as with anything you could call soil, and where the air off the standing water carried something far worse than mud. Local labor would not go near either place for long, and the reasons were different at each site, but the outcome was the same. At Lockport, it was the sheer physical danger of blasting through rock with hand drills and black powder, work that maimed men in ways a farmer weighing whether to sign on for a season could see for himself, just by watching a crew for an afternoon. At the marsh it was worse, because the danger there was invisible until it had already taken hold. Farmers signed on, worked a season, and did not come back. So the contractors who had won the bidding for these sections turned to a labor pool that had just started arriving in large numbers at the port of New York. Irish immigrants, most of them Catholic, most of them from the southern and western counties of Ireland. Clare, Cork, Galway, Sligo, Tipperary. This was not yet the great famine migration that most people picture when they think of Irish arrival in America. That catastrophe was still 2 decades away. This was an earlier wave, smaller and far less remembered today, made up of men who came looking for wage labor and found it waiting for them in a ditch. Ship arrival records from the port of New York show Irish immigration climbing steadily through the 1820s, years before the famine would turn that steady climb into a flood. Passenger manifests from this period list departure ports concentrated around Cork, Dublin, and Belfast, with a smaller but steady stream routed through Liverpool, where an Irish passenger might board a ship already carrying English and Scottish emigrants bound for the same American port. The crossing itself ran anywhere from 5 to 8 weeks, depending on wind and season, in steerage conditions that were cramped and unpleasant well before the famine ships made conditions on the Atlantic crossing into their own particular kind of infamous. A man who survived that crossing and stepped off a ship at the Battery with no money, no trade, and no family already settled in America was, in a very direct sense, exactly the kind of laborer a canal contractor standing on the same dock was hoping to find. Recruiting agents worked the New York docks directly, meeting ships as they landed and offering work on the spot to men who had crossed the Atlantic with almost nothing left in their pockets. Contractors sometimes advanced the price of onward travel against future wages, a debt that bound a man to the shovel before he had swung it once, and that in some documented cases kept him working a section he might otherwise have walked away from. The pay itself was modest by any standard, often less than $1 a day for common labor, with board and a daily ration of whiskey built into the arrangement, almost as a form of currency in its own right. Contractors believed the whiskey kept men working through conditions that would otherwise have driven them off the line entirely. In the swamp sections they were probably right, at least for a while, though it came at its own cost that nobody was tracking closely at the time. At Lockport, the rock itself required a different kind of skill than a shovel could offer, and the contractors who won that section went looking specifically for men who already knew stone. They found them among Welsh immigrants, a smaller but highly distinct group whose surnames cluster in the Lockport payroll and parish records, the way no other name group does in that particular town. Roberts, Evans, Jones, Williams, Hughes, Pritchard, Owens. Wales had a centuries-old tradition of quarrying and stone masonry behind it, and the men who carried these names to Niagara County were not general laborers looking for whatever work they could find. They were tradesmen, brought in specifically because the deep cut demanded precision and rock-reading experience that raw manpower alone could not deliver. Local place names in the area still carry the trace of it. A hamlet a few miles from Lockport is called Wales Centre to this day, and Welsh chapels, some using the Welsh word capel on their cornerstones, held services in the Welsh language in that corner of Niagara County well into the 1860s, decades after the digging itself was finished. The engineering credit for the deep cut belongs to Nathan Roberts, whose design for the Flight of Five let boats climb the escarpment in a staircase of locks rather than a single impossible rise, and his name is the one that appears on historical markers today. But the men who actually drilled the blast holes by hand, packed the black powder charges, and hauled the shattered rock out of the cut by the wagon load were mostly Welsh and Irish laborers whose names appear nowhere near the engineering credit and everywhere in the local township records once the work was done. The town that grew up around the base of the cut kept the pattern permanently. A neighborhood there became known locally as Lowertown, and its residents for a full generation afterward carried exactly the surnames the payroll ledgers show, passed down through families who never left once the contract work ran out. The deep cut killed men, though nobody kept a complete count of how many. Blasting accidents, rock falls, and the simple hazard of working with early black powder charges in a confined stone trench took a toll that local histories describe in general terms rather than precise numbers, because precise numbers were never systematically recorded in the first place. That absence of account is itself part of what the record shows. A workforce whose individual deaths were not consistently logged was a workforce whose names mattered less to the people keeping the ledgers than the pace of the digging did. What survives instead are scattered mentions in 19th century local newspapers, a burial here, an accident there, never gathered into a single accounting anyone thought worth compiling at the time. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Montezuma Marsh told a darker version of the same story, and it is the section of the canal that the surviving record treats with the most unease, because the marsh extracted a price that even a bookkeeping system indifferent to individual names could not entirely ignore. The wetlands stretched for miles near the canal's crossing of the Seneca and Cayuga outlets, close to what would become the villages of Jordan and Weedsport, and the standing water bred mosquitoes carrying what the workers themselves called canal fever, what we would now recognize as malaria. Entire labor gangs came down with the shaking fevers within weeks of starting work in the marsh. Contractors hired replacement crews knowing in advance, from bitter experience on earlier stretches, that a meaningful portion of them would not finish the season upright. Quinine existed by this period but was expensive, unreliably supplied to a rural construction camp, and used inconsistently at best. Workers who fell ill mostly just endured the fever in shifts, the way malaria runs its own cycle, and went back to digging in the gaps between attacks because a man who did not work did not get paid. The men who dug that stretch were overwhelmingly Irish and overwhelmingly poor, arriving with almost nothing beyond the clothes on their backs, and a name that a clerk somewhere along the line would write down however it sounded to an ear unfamiliar with an Irish accent. Local township histories from Cayuga and Seneca counties describe burial grounds near the marsh crossing that were never formally surveyed, workers interred close to where they died because moving a fever-ridden body any real distance was neither practical nor, to the contractors managing a fixed construction timeline, especially urgent. Some of these sites are remembered today only through local oral tradition and scattered 19th century newspaper mentions, not through any formal cemetery record with names attached. A man could dig for 6 months, die of the fever that had already taken his tent mates, and leave no documentary trace beyond a line on a payroll sheet that itself was not preserved past that season's final accounting to the state. This is where the surname record becomes genuinely difficult to trace, and where the difficulty itself is evidence of something worth naming directly. The Munster and Connacht Irish who worked the marsh crossing carried names common enough today across the American Northeast that almost nobody assumes a direct line back to 1820 just from hearing them. Kelly, Murphy, Ryan, Sullivan, Walsh, Doyle, Gallagher, Boyle, Flynn, Malone, Nolan, Brennan, Hogan, Fitzgerald, Riley, Coyne. These are not rare names requiring a specialist archive to locate. They are common enough that their very commonness has worked against family memory, because a name that ordinary rarely triggers the question of where, specifically, it entered the American record, and through what specific job it arrived attached to. Census enumerators in 1830 and 1840, working the townships that had grown up directly along the finished canal, recorded exactly the clustering you would expect if you already knew the construction history behind it. Household after household with Irish surnames clustered in the poorer wards of towns like Weedsport and Port Byron and the growing settlements around the marsh crossing, a full generation before the famine migration that most people associate with Irish arrival in America in the first place. The canal came first. The men who dug it did not go home once the water started flowing through it. Many of them stayed exactly where the work had put them, married, and raised children in the same townships, and their descendants show up in later census records as simply local. The immigrant origin folded quietly into ordinary American residency within 2 generations of the digging. The German surnames tell a related but distinct story, one that traces less to the initial digging and more to the canal's long operational life afterward. Once the waterway opened in 1825, it needed constant maintenance. Lock tenders, toll collectors, and repair crews stationed at fixed intervals along its full length, year-round, for decades. German immigrants, arriving through the same ports and often recruited through similar contractor networks, took up a disproportionate share of these permanent salaried canal positions, particularly in the towns along the canal's central stretch near Herkimer and Little Falls. Names like Schneider, Mueller, Weber, and Fisher appear in canal company employment records from the 1830s and 1840s, tied specifically to lockkeeper housing, small stone or timber structures the canal company built and maintained at intervals along the route for exactly this purpose. A lockkeeper's post was often effectively hereditary in practice, if not in law. A father held the position for 20 or 30 years, and a son who had grown up in the same small house beside the same lock simply stepped into the job when the father retired or died, and the family surname stayed attached to that one specific lock number for 2 or sometimes 3 generations running. What happened to those names afterward follows a pattern familiar to anyone who has traced German-American ancestry through this period of New York history. Schneider became Snyder, and sometimes drifted further into Taylor once someone translated the meaning rather than the sound. Mueller became Miller. Weber occasionally stayed Weber, but just as often drifted toward Weaver, again a translation rather than a phonetic guess. The Anglicization did not happen through any single decree or policy handed down from above. It happened one clerk, one census taker, one school teacher at a time, each of them writing down a name the way it sounded easiest to an English-speaking ear, or the way it translated most naturally into an English trade word, and each small alteration compounding over the following decades until a family that arrived in America as Mueller might be recorded as Miller within 2 census cycles, with nobody along the way making a conscious decision to change anything at all. The name simply drifted, the way water finds the lowest available channel on its own. Family researchers working this specific corridor today tend to describe the same experience once they finally connect a surname to a canal contract. A name that had always been treated in the family as simply Irish, or simply German, without any more specific story attached to it, suddenly has a location and a job. A great-great-grandmother's maiden name turns out to match a labor gang roster for the Lockport section. A family cemetery plot in a town nobody in the family could explain living in turns out to sit less than a mile from a lock the surname was tied to for 2 generations of lock keepers. Local historical societies along the canal corridor report a steady stream of exactly this kind of inquiry. Descendants who grew up believing their family simply appeared in upstate New York sometime in the 1800s, with no further explanation on offer, discovering that the explanation was sitting the entire time in a contractor ledger nobody had thought to open. The hardest population to trace in this entire record is also the one the documentary sources say the least about, and the silence itself is worth naming directly rather than working around it. Free black laborers worked in and around the canal corridor throughout its construction and its early decades of operation, in roles that included teamster work, general labor, and skilled trades like blacksmithing that the growing canal towns needed in steady supply. What the surviving payroll ledgers and contractor records do not reliably provide is a consistent accounting of these workers by full name, in the way they at least attempted, however imperfectly, for the immigrant labor gangs. Race was inconsistently recorded on wage rolls. Full names were frequently reduced to a single first name, or left off entirely. The free black communities that took root in canal corridor towns like Syracuse and Rochester in the decades following construction have had to reconstruct their own genealogical record largely through church registers, particularly African Methodist Episcopal Zion congregations founded in those towns in the 1820s and 1830s, rather than through the canal company's own paperwork, which simply was not built to preserve their presence. This is not a case where the evidence points firmly enough in one direction for a video like this one to simply hand you a clean list of names. It is closer to what the record itself keeps insisting on, in its gaps as much as in what it does contain. An absence that is not neutral. A payroll system that tracked an Irish laborer's surname closely enough for contractors to argue over its correct spelling, while declining to record a black laborer's surname at all in the same ledger, was not failing at ordinary bookkeeping. It was expressing, through what it chose to write down and what it chose to leave blank, exactly whose presence the official account of the canal considered worth preserving for later. Where family oral history in Syracuse's or Rochester's older black congregations points toward a canal-era ancestor, that oral tradition is frequently the strongest thread available today, stronger in practice than the incomplete written record it has to stand in for. Look at the mechanism across all of these name groups together, and a single pattern emerges from underneath the different surface details. An Irish name got respelled by a clerk who had never heard it before and made his best guess at the sound. A German name drifted toward its nearest English equivalent over 2 or 3 census cycles, sometimes by sound and sometimes by meaning. A Welsh name held its original form somewhat longer, likely because the skilled trade attached to it gave the man carrying it slightly more standing in the eyes of whoever was writing the ledger that week. A black laborer's name, in the worst documented cases, was never fully recorded to begin with, and so there was nothing left to drift or anglicize because there was nothing written down to erode. None of this was a single deliberate policy handed down from Albany. It was thousands of small clerical decisions made by hundreds of different hands across 8 years of construction and decades of subsequent operation, each decision small enough on its own to seem unremarkable at the time, and each one shaving a little more of the original name away with it. What survives of all this sits in plain sight today, in towns most people drive through without ever knowing why their older neighborhoods look and feel the way they do. Rochester's oldest Irish district clustered near the Genesee River Aqueduct crossing, in a section locals called Dublin for more than a century afterward, its street names and parish records still carrying the surnames of the men who worked that stretch of the canal through the city. Syracuse has a hill on its near east side, still known today as Tipperary Hill, named directly for the Irish county so many of its original residents had left behind, and the neighborhood is famous today for a traffic light installed with the green lamp above the red, a small local rebellion by canal-era descendants who wanted their own corner of the city to answer to nobody's convention but its own. Buffalo's old First Ward grew up around the canal's western terminus, and the grain trade that followed it, its Irish surnames persisting in church rolls and dockworker union halls for generations after the shovels stopped moving through the dirt. Lockport's Lowertown still sits at the base of the Flight of Five, its older families tracing back, when they trace at all, to the exact Welsh and Irish crews who blasted the rock rising above their houses. Little Falls and Herkimer, further east along the canal's central stretch, kept a smaller but steady German presence, tied directly to the lockkeeper housing, some of it visible today in church records and cemetery rolls that never fully anglicized, even after the names themselves had. Utica sat roughly at the canal's midpoint, and its old Bag Square district, close by the water, grew into another concentration of exactly this kind of surname clustering, Irish and German households packed close together in the same wards for the better part of a century after the digging finished, and the effect did not stop at the canal's own banks. Once the waterway opened in 1825, freight and passenger traffic to the west increased dramatically, and the same corridor that had brought immigrant laborers east to dig it became the route their children and grandchildren used to move further west, into Ohio, Michigan, and beyond, carrying the same surnames into census records in states the original laborers themselves never saw. A name that first shows up in a Cayuga County payroll ledger in 1821 can, with the right amount of patient searching, sometimes be tracked forward through a Rochester parish register in 1840, and then into an Ohio township 30 years after that, the whole family's westward path essentially following the water their own relatives, or their neighbors' relatives, had once dug by hand. None of these neighborhoods announce their origin loudly to a visitor passing through. They look, on the surface, like any other older working-class district in upstate New York, the kind of place with a corner church, a handful of taverns older than anyone can quite date, and street names nobody thinks to ask about. But the surname patterns embedded in their oldest church registers, their earliest census tracts, and their 19th century cemetery rolls trace directly and specifically back to construction contracts let out for bid between 1817 and 1825. A family that has lived in one of these towns for 6 generations without ever being told a specific ancestor dug the canal may simply be looking at the wrong kind of record, or not looking at all, because nobody in the family ever thought to connect an ordinary surname to a specific construction contract 2 centuries old. It is worth sitting with what the canal actually did once it opened, because the scale of that outcome is part of why the labor behind it deserves a closer look than it usually gets. Freight costs between Buffalo and New York City dropped by something close to 90% within a few years of the water opening, and a trip that had taken weeks by wagon now took days by barge. The canal turned New York City into the dominant port on the eastern seaboard, opened the Great Lakes Basin to eastern markets, and pulled the entire center of American westward expansion up through the exact corridor these laborers had dug. None of that happened because of the engineers alone, and none of it happened because of DeWitt Clinton's political will alone. It happened because a rotating, largely anonymous workforce of Irish, Welsh, German, and black laborers put picks and shovels into ground that ranged from solid rock to disease-bearing swamp, for wages that were modest even by the standards of their own time, and then in a great many cases simply stayed in the towns the digging had left behind. The paper trail, where it survives, is more accessible than most people researching their own family history expect it to be. Canal Company payroll ledgers survive today in the New York State Archives and in the collection of the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse, organized by section and by contractor rather than by worker, which means the research runs backward from a known location to a possible name, rather than the other way around. County histories written in the 1870s and 1880s, when many former canal laborers or their children were still alive to be interviewed by local historians, often list contractor names and labor gang compositions in more detail than people expect from a source that old. The 1830 and 1840 federal census, cross-referenced against the exact townships the canal physically passed through, will show whether a surname was already clustering in a specific place before the famine migration that most family trees default to as the automatic explanation for any Irish arrival in America. And DNA testing, for what it is worth on its own, cannot tell you your ancestor dug at Lockport or drained fever in the Montezuma Marsh. Only the paper can tell you that. The DNA can only tell you where the bloodline that carried the surname originated before it ever reached the dock at New York in the first place. So here they are again, the names the ditch left behind. If your surname is Kelly, Murphy, Ryan, Sullivan, Walsh, Doyle, Gallagher, Boyle, Flynn, Malone, Nolan, Brennan, Hogan, Fitzgerald, Riley, or Coyne, your family may sit somewhere in the Montezuma Marsh crossing or the general labor gangs that dug the bulk of the route by hand. If your name is Roberts, Evans, Jones, Williams, Hughes, Pritchard, or Owens, your family may trace to the Stonemasons who cut the deep cut at Lockport out of solid rock. If your name is Schneider, Snyder, Mueller, Miller, Weber, Weaver, or Fisher, your family may trace to the lockkeeper houses that dotted the canal's central stretch for a full century of continuous operation. And if your family's oral history holds a fragment about an ancestor in the canal, with no surname or written record to confirm it, that fragment may be the only trace left of a laborer the official ledgers never fully wrote down to begin with. The canal is still there, running through the same towns, past the same church registers, waiting on the same paper trail. Somewhere in it, a good number of the people watching this video right now have a name still buried in the ditch. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.